masajid. So for us, we have the holiest three places in the world. Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, Masjid al-Nabawi, the Prophet Masjid in Al-Madinah, and the Masjid al-Aqsa in Al-Quds, Jerusalem, Al-Quds. Now, who built Jerusalem? Who built Jerusalem? The first people lived in Palestine and built Jerusalem. Who are the first, or who were the first people lived in Palestine? The Arab Kan'aniyin, the Kan'ans Arabs. So I want, inshallah, to learn about Kan'aniyin. Remember this word. So it is called the land of Canaan. The Canaan is a part of Arab. So who are the first people lived in Palestine? Jews or Arabs? Arab. So we are the people who lived Palestine first, and it is our land and the historical right in Palestine for Arabs. Second, we believe in all prophets and messengers. We believe in all prophets and messengers. We believe in Muhammad, Moses, Jesus, all of them. So they are Muslims. So Moses, Sayyidina Musa was Muslim. Sayyidina Dawood was Muslim. So we believe in all prophets and messengers. So no one has the right to say, because I believe in Moses, so I have the right to take Palestine. And to tell Palestine is for the land of Arabs, the people who lived there. So who is from Palestine, for example? Who from Palestine? MashaAllah. I am from Palestine. Let me tell you, what is your village or city in Palestine? You are from Quds, Jerusalem? MashaAllah. You are from Quds. Congratulations. I love that. Anybody else? You are from? Yes. What is your city, village in Palestine? I am from Jaffa. Who knows Jaffa? Who knows? I am from Jaffa. Jaffa, village near Jaffa. And my father was taken out from his home. My father was 12 years old, and my grandfather and his family was kicked out from his own house, and somebody else came and lived in my house in Yazur, in Jaffa. And you know how many millions of Palestinians who lost their villages and cities and homes because of the occupation. So we believe that Palestine is a holy land. We believe that Jerusalem is a holy place, and it is. Okay. That's okay. So we believe that it is a holy land, right? So now we learned and we know that we believe in justice. We believe in justice. We believe in returning back the rights for its people. So we have rights. We need to learn about our rights. We need to learn about our justice. We need to learn about how to be good people, peaceful people, asking and working day and night for our rights, right? I don't want to take more time because we have a great speakers today, inshallah. They will help us to learn and benefit and knowing more about our rights in Palestine. So it is very important to learn about your rights in Palestine. The historical rights, the religious rights, and the rights of Palestinians now. They have rights in Palestine. As I said, we have refugees. You know how many refugees, Palestinian refugees, in Palestine and out of Palestine? You know how much? Anybody? I will leave the answer for our sister. She will answer you, and she will ask you this question. To know how many Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, in West Bank, in Gaza Strip, and Egypt, Iraq. We have refugees everywhere, and they have the right to return back to their homes. So we need to stand up for justice, to stand up for our rights and their rights. And it is not only Muslims who have to stand up for justice and human rights and Palestinian rights. Every human being has to stand up for justice and for human rights and Palestinian rights. Not only Palestinian rights, for any human being rights, right? We have to stand up for justice. So, any question before? Yes, any question before leaving? Because our sister, what's your name? Abir. Inshallah, our sister Abir, she will, inshallah, explain more, and she will give more information about this holy subject, a great subject. I want you to read books about that. I promise you, inshallah, to spread to you some books about the Palestinian cause. I, inshallah, will have, inshallah, competition about information and knowledge about Palestine, and we will have, inshallah, prizes and awards for answering that competition. Any question before giving the mic to Sister Abir? Any question? I think you are ready to listen to Abir. Yes, sir. You know, we have to stand, first, knowledge, education. We have to learn. And we have to stand up for our rights. We live in America. We can do a lot. We can make rallies. We can spread news and the truth about the Palestinians' rights and so on. So we have many things. So we have to support our people in Jerusalem, in Sheikh Jarrah. You have to learn about Sheikh Jarrah. You have to learn about Silwan, how much Palestinians are suffering because of the occupation and of settlements and the settlers. So we want you to learn, read, and also support them by dua, support them by education, support them by talking to the representatives in the Senate and Congress, just to understand our situation and our rights. So this is a part, and the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, go and visit the Masjid al-Aqsa. If you can't, send olive oil for its lamps. At that time, they used to put olive oil in the lamp to enlight it. So in these days, it means support the people of Jerusalem, support the people of Sheikh Jarrah. So we have to spread the truth and talk about their rights. There is no meaning to support any cause or any right without knowledge, without good, strong information about any subject. So we want to learn, and this session, because of that, we want to empower you with knowledge, with education, and to empower you with the right way of standing strongly for your rights. And you have to understand what are the best ways, the peaceful ways to support our people in Palestine. We have many ways, peaceful ways, to support our people in Palestine, especially through the media, through the Facebook, through the talking to our friends, to make lectures like this, and so on. Any question? So let us go to Sister Abir, inshallah. She will be the best, inshallah, to educate us and also to have more information. Jazakumullah khair.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. So my name is Abir. I'm here on behalf of PAC, the Palestinian American Community Center in Clifton. So we've done a couple of these workshops, especially the last couple months. We've been asked to do more of these workshops. So if there's anything specific that's not on here that you don't see on the agenda, but you do want to talk about, just let me know and we can get to it. But the kind of main thing on the agenda that we usually do with these workshops is just a general overview of what's going on. And we're going to go through the history, right? And we talked about this a little bit already, but education is the first step, right? Before the protests, before the rallies. Sometimes we care a lot about Palestine and we want to show that, and we think that's the best way to show that. And those are important, right? The question about what do we do and how do we free it. Protests and rallies throughout history have shown us that they make a change, but what are you going to protest for if you don't know what you're fighting against, right? Or if you don't know what you're fighting for. And so that's the main point of this workshop. So we'll do we'll just do an overview of what's going on. We're going to do a little conversation about how do we make Palestine a part of social justice conversations. So in this country, there's a lot of social justice conversations that happens. Like you all remember, maybe the Black Lives Matter protests and movement from last year, right? But a lot of times we'll talk about every issue in social justice, but we don't talk about Palestine. And there's a reason behind that. And we want to start figuring out how do we insert Palestine into this country's larger social justice conversations, and that's one of the changes that's actually really important and something you can do to make that difference. We're going to go through some key words and definitions, right? We can't talk about Palestine without knowing what the words apartheid means. How many people know what the word apartheid means? How many people have heard the word apartheid? But we don't know what it means, right? So we've heard it. We hear in the protests, Israel's an apartheid state. But what does that mean? Why is it important? Why do we make sure we say that at protests, right? What is ethnic cleansing? What is genocide? We're going to learn about all those words. What is settler colonialism? That's the most important one, especially for this year. We'll go through it. So again, we'll go through important dates in history. We're going to tie it all the way back to what's happening right now, and then we'll get into what you guys can do. I'm going to keep my eye on the time. I know I have until 5, but we're gonna take this as we go. So some important kind of words before, these aren't the main words I was talking about, but some words: justice, social justice, humanitarian and international law, and religion, right? These are the words that come up a lot when we hear about Palestine. And notice I don't say Israel, right? It's Palestine. If we're referring to the actual, this is just me on a personal advice, I guess, what I do. If we are referring to the land or the territories that Israel took over, I will call that either 1948, right, or post-1948, or the occupied Palestinian territories. So just in case I refer to that, that's my way of not allowing history to actually erase Palestine. So we also need to make sure we keep saying it. So these are the words that come up a lot, right? Religion is used as the excuse to justify why it is that Israel needs to be created, right? How many people heard of the myth that was first used by Zionists, a land without a people for a people without a land? Has anyone heard that before? Does anyone know what that means or where that comes from? So that was one of the very first Zionist myths. Do we all know what Zionism means? What is Zionism? You're gonna shout it out? Yes. You can shout out the answer, yeah, whoever. So it's a political ideology, right? Zionism emerged as a political ideology or belief to justify taking over Palestine, right? And they use religion as a part of Zionism to say that Jewish people need a safe homeland because of what happened in the Holocaust. We have religious ties to Jerusalem as Jewish people, so therefore it is rightfully ours, right? And so they use that. And they use a lot of the European guilt of what happened in the Holocaust to get the support in the first place, right? This is how they weaponize their religion. And actually, if you study true Judaism, Jewish people are not allowed or supposed to have a homeland until their Messiah comes. So when we see a lot of the Orthodox Jewish people who come out in support of Palestine, there's a lot of Jewish people who support Palestine. Those are Orthodox Jewish people who actually have studied their religion and know that they're not supposed to have a homeland in real Judaism until their Messiah comes. Right, and so that's why this excuse or abuse of their religion to justify the occupation is completely wrong. right? And if anyone ever says that, you can use that very confidently and say, actually, true Orthodox Jewish religion does not allow for Jewish people to have a homeland. Yes. Yes. Where should they settle? So that's another important thing. And actually, and this is why history is important. Because way before 1948, why do I keep referring to 1948? Does anyone know what happened in 1948? Yes, shout it out. What is the word that happened in 1948? What's the specific word? Do we know? All of them are correct, but I'm looking for a specific word, which we'll get to it. We're gonna talk about it. But where were they supposed to go? So actually, and this is why we critique Zionism as a political tool, is that there were Muslim, Jewish, and Christian people living in Palestine and in Jerusalem very happily, very fine and well, way before the establishment or the thinking of Israel, right? So the point is, and this is what we say, is it's not about not giving Jewish people a safe place, right? What happened in the Holocaust was awful, but what they did in return was remake that oppression, right? And reproduce it against someone else for political domination and control. If they just wanted a safe place as Jewish people to practice their religion and be who they are, they could have immigrated into Palestine and they would have been fine, right? They could have asked. They could have been refugees and went into a different safe place. But what they did instead, and this is where we can undo that myth that Israel's created because Jewish people need a homeland, they're using that as an excuse to have complete power and control and domination. And you can say that, if you study the true history of Palestine, they were living there. There were Jewish people already there, right? Very fine and safely and happily. Yes. Did you have a question? Yeah? So what happened? So what happened in the Holocaust, right? World War II, Nazi Germany. In Germany, there were Nazis, there were fascists, led by Adolf Hitler, and he was an awful man, right? He ethnically cleansed, he completely erased and wanted to wipe out any Jewish person. So they needed a safe place outside of Europe, right? They needed a safe place outside of Germany at that time. That's why they started needing to immigrate or to go somewhere else. But yeah, that actually is a really good idea of why do you need a homeland, right? Why do you need a specific nation that's yours if you can just live well with other people? That goes back to the power and control that Zionists want. They chose Palestine so they can use religion as the excuse because Jerusalem is in Palestine. And there are lots of Jewish ties, and it's important, right? It's important Jewish religious ties to Palestine, and the British actually helped give Palestine. And so we're gonna actually move on and we're gonna talk about that. But the British played a big role in why Palestine, because the British used to occupy Palestine before Israel. And right before they left, they gave Palestine to Israel as they were leaving. But we'll get to that in the history part. So let's focus on the justice and the social justice part, right? How do we make sure Palestine is in the conversation of larger conversations in this country of social justice? Has anyone seen this image before? What is this image trying to tell us? Anyone can just go. Okay, go ahead. Equality is not always justice. Exactly. Why not? Shout it out. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly, right? It's about who needs what. Equality is nice, but sometimes giving everyone exactly the same thing isn't actually what we need, right? Instead, what is needed is that tall man, he can see fine with or without a box, right? If he's gonna be really greedy and be like, well, everyone else got one, so let me get one just because I want one. But if you really think about it, does he need it? No. Instead, we can give 2 boxes to the shorter person, and then everyone can see, right? And that's the point of equity versus equality. Right, so and this kind of ties in, and the reason I bring this up is if when we're talking about Palestine or Israel or post-48, right, a lot of times we're saying, well, Jewish and Muslim people or Palestinians and Israelis should have exactly the same thing. But at this moment right now, Israelis have so much more than Palestinians that having the same thing isn't enough. Having the same thing keeps bringing Israel all the way up here, and Palestine still maybe all the way up here, right? So this is to get us to think about power and privilege. And this is a good internal reflection and thought too. What do you have that you need? What do you have that you may not need, but could give to someone who does need it, right? And this is the whole point of social justice. And I'm gonna add in two other ones, because I actually like this image more. And I think this image is what we should actually be fighting for, right? The reality is what we see on the bottom left, right? The reality is that people who don't need things usually have the most. They have more power, they have more privilege. People who really, really need it are even more at the bottom. But what we're truly fighting for, right, and especially when we're talking about Palestine, what we really want is not just more human rights, not just more peace treaties, not just more ceasefires, right? We want full liberation. So what this last image under liberation is trying to tell us or get us to question is, it's nice to give someone equity, right? Get the 2 boxes instead of 1, we're all gonna see over the fence. But the real question should be, why is there a fence in the first place? Right, so when we're talking about the liberation of Palestine, we want more Palestinian human rights and we want peace, et cetera, et cetera. What we really should be doing is beyond that is, how do we get to the full liberation of Palestine? How do we take down that wall that divides up the West Bank? How do we make Gaza no longer an open-air prison? It's not just about how to make Gaza livable while they still have to live in those conditions. It's about, why are those conditions there in the first place? Right? And that's what we really need to be thinking about if we're going to get to the true liberation of Palestine. Right? Why is the Israeli occupation there in the first place? So right now, a lot of humanitarian orgs focus on just making life livable for Palestinians, which is important. People need to survive right now. But the larger vision and the larger goal should always be full liberation, right? Knock down the whole wall. And that's where right of return comes in, and self-determination. And so this is why when people say, well, what do Palestinians want? They just want peace treaties, they just want help from the NGOs. That's fine, but that's short-term relief. That's short-term survival. The long-term survival is true liberation. Self-determination means you have your own country, your own laws, your own government, where you are the ones who can control how you move and what you do, right? You have a Palestinian government made up of Palestinians actually representing Palestinian people, not a couple within the larger government that has more Israeli officials than Palestinians, right? We want right of return, which means we're not just saying that we don't want to get kicked out of our homes. We want the right to go back to every single home that families were kicked out of in 1948. That's the right of return. That's what we're talking about. So what we want to start thinking about is beyond just small short-term relief for Palestinians. How do we get full and true liberation for Palestine? Does that make sense? Okay. So do we, I think I know the answer to this, but do we think understanding the Palestinian struggle is important? Yes, right? And we talked, I think the opening kind of covered this, and for the sake of time, we can move on. But why for you is it important? And maybe we don't need to share it out loud, but just take 30 seconds, right? Beyond it being you being Palestinian or your family, I'm actually not Palestinian. But my whole life and all my life's work has been about Palestine, whether in school or activism. And there was a reason to that. I'm not that far away from Palestine, so I'm Lebanese, so we've also had to deal with Israeli invasions in the south, right? But beyond that, I'm someone who truly believes in social justice for everything and everyone, right? And Palestine comes into that because of me. So it's not about whether you're Palestinian, Muslim, whatever. Those are gonna add layers of why we care, right? But in general, truly think, why is understanding Palestinian struggle important? And just take 30 seconds, think it through yourself. And then, do we think history is important? And this is where for a lot of younger folks, we say, no, it already happened. Why does it matter? Why are we learning about this? And I was actually teaching a class right before this, and we focused on 1967, which is the Naksa. And it's not in this PowerPoint, but I might actually change it up a little bit and have us watch it. How many people have heard about what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah or Silwan recently? What's happening? They're taking over their homes, right? Exactly, right? We're seeing the actual ethnic cleansing, and Israeli settlers are coming in and kicking people out of their homes. Do you guys think that just happened out of nowhere in May? Or is this a continuation of what happened in 1948 and 1967? 1967 is called the Naksa. It was a defeat. It was a 6-day war. Israel fought Arab countries who were trying to help Palestine, and they lost. From that war, Israel gained access to more areas of Palestine: the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. East Jerusalem is what's being fought over right now. So what's happening in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah right now is actually 50 years of courts dates going back and forth into court meetings, and the Israeli courts just now in 2021, from the cases from 1967, allowed Israeli settlers to go in and take over the homes in East Jerusalem. What happened in Al-Aqsa, the attack on Al-Aqsa, I'm sure we all knew about that. That's a continuation of the 1967 control from Israel of Jerusalem, of East Jerusalem. So for me, that's why history is important. Everything that's happening in Palestine today has some roots and goes back to history. So I just, in general, as me as a person, I love history and I'm a historian at heart. But in general, right, for Palestine specifically too, and in general about life, history is always dictating what happens today and helps us understand what we need to do to help Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan right now. And then the last question to really think about is listening to our elders, right? Especially when we're talking about Palestine, or as Muslims, right? Or as anyone who comes from a marginalized group. Our history is not the history in the textbooks. Our lived reality, what truly happened to our people in our communities, is not what you're gonna learn at school, especially in American public education. I had read a lot of books about this, but I struggled to find these books. And I was shocked when I found people who actually wrote about this. Sometimes the only thing we can rely on, and the best thing we can rely on, is the stories and the lived realities of our elders and our families, right? And just asking questions. You want to know what happened about the Nakba? If those of you who raise your hand and are Palestinian, ask someone, ask your family members, ask your grandparents, ask them if they had any ties to the Nakba. Was our family part of the Palestinians who had to leave in 1948 and be a refugee somewhere else? If you're here, most likely yes, right? Ask where you ended up first, and then where they had to go to, and then what they did to end up here, right, in New Jersey. And the audio works on this, right, I hope. But so we're gonna watch this, and because listening to elders is very important to me, and as a non-Palestinian, I wanna make sure we hear Palestinian voices when we're talking about Palestine. To transition us into important dates of history, we're gonna hear from this older woman who lived through the Nakba. She talks in full Arabic, so there are some parts are a little hard to understand, but there's subtitles and it's all translated. And we can pause through it if we need to, but we're just gonna hear from her what she witnessed and her experience going through it. I don't think the audio is working.
اليوم إذا الحرب حرب الجراد يا لأنه خرب عندي قتلنا أو قتل الفدائي الله قتلوا وأختي قتلوها وأخوي فدائي قتلوه وولد أخوي فدائي قتل الجزيرة لكن من عرضنا نعرف نزرع وندرس ونعرف الناس وبنفتح أصطاد في التلفون ولا في كرهب نتعصب شعير نزرع قمح نجازم نسوي بطيخ باني حاجة نزرع على المطر الفرد عليه 6 أشهر سجن وهو ياخذ مساعدة البرود على أصبح ما حد يبين الدرس الإنجليزي ثم بياخذ ضرائب الغنم الكثير عليه ياخذ عليه والناس لا حول ولا قوة الناس تشتري صناعات كذا رحل وهو تولى على طول مع البلبوم ذاك رحلونا لسكن مدوا وزير بسويح شركة أن تتبع أول ما جاءوا صاروا لن يرحمه وناس كثيرين بيطلعوا بالليل بالليل بيجيبوا المصطفى حافظ الشريات من عند المؤمن ثمانيات صغار تعرفوا قطعة دانا ثمانيات صغار يقدمون المصطفى حافظ الله يرحمه مصطفى حافظ أحسن واحد في حكومة فلسطين.
لما جو اليهود كيف اطلعوا؟ كنتوا وين كنتوا ساكنين؟
ما ساكنين ترجعنا عرفنا قبل الناس نطخ ولا الجبات نجيب العالم ولا الناس شغلت شوف قتلوا ناس كثيرين قتلوا ولا عمك حنس عمك حنس حاطين طريقة رجلي ربوا حاطين شيء جعلنا سليم اللي كانوا كويسين بحال المصريين اللي وين شيء تكتر منهم كثير من الرديت من الناس صاروا يجربوهم قلب الجربات جرب الناس اللي تكتلوا الفلسطينيين ومن مصريين الناس يفكروا في النصر يجيهم من كذي وتريد الدبابات جايات على الناس قتلوه قتلوا اختي وهو قتلوا ولا هو من ساكن في الكنز بس هو ليه كانوا مشرق على الكنز رجع من هناك ياكلوا منه ويبيعوا منه قتلوا ولا هو مروح يا ولد الكبير والصغير ما بوفر حد والولد ما بوفر ويحدى يهودي ولا هو واحد ولا الموضوع هم الطيارات يوصل من هذا كيف عايز من كتب
Okay. So we watched that to hear, like, she actually lived through it, right? So she shared, there's three most important things that she shared that I want us to focus on. The first is what she said about what happens, because there's a lot of times where we hear people say, well, if Palestinians cared enough, why did they leave, right? Or why didn't Palestinians stay and fight? But what did she say? Where if you had just a gun, automatically it was 6 months in jail. If you had a rifle, it was a lot worse. And then she said towards the end, they spared nobody, right? If there was a little boy and there was an Israeli tank and he was in the way of someone or something, they wouldn't care, right? They would just kill everybody, especially in the beginning. That's how they asserted their domination and their control. So it's very easy for us and for other people to say, well, if they cared enough, why did they leave and why didn't they just stay and fight for their homes, right? But if people have families and you put yourself in that situation, if you have a whole family, are you gonna put them all at risk or are you gonna try to do what you can to protect them or save them, right? And the people who did fight, there are a lot of people still fighting today. If they did do that, they would get thrown away in jail right away or killed. So they were used as examples, and that would be done on purpose to show people, if you don't listen, if you don't go with the occupation, this is what's gonna happen to you. The second thing that she said that I want to focus on is she mentioned Britain, right? She said the British left and they came. So we're gonna need to focus on how it was that Israel got control of Palestine in the first place. We have to go back to 1917 and 1948 and talk about the British complicity in this. And then she mentioned the Egyptians too, right? She said that the Egyptians helped and the Palestinians and Egyptians were fighting, but they lost. So let's also keep that in mind. I talked about the Naksa in 1967. That's what she's referring to about Egyptians helping. Okay. So some key terms before we get into all this history, because the history isn't going to make sense unless we're all on the same page about this term. So I asked about Zionism, right? And I mentioned Zionism is the political ideology, right, that believes that Israel should exist and should be occupying Palestine as a settler colonial state. Do we know what settler colonial state means? Do we know what colonialism means? Do you know what colonialism means? Yes. So that's settler colonialism, right? Is when you go in and you settle. Yeah, so normal colonialism, right? And this happened to many Arab countries and just many countries around the world. And for example, this country, before its independence from the British, America was 13 colonies, right, that belonged to the British. So the word colonialism or colonization means that there's another government or larger entity of power controlling a different country, but from far away. Right, so they can control you, they can tell you what to do, but they're not actually coming in and moving and like living in your country. Settler colonialism is when they do come in, right? The word settle. They come in, they settle, and they start taking control of that country by displacing the people who were there in the first place, the indigenous people to that land, right? People who are native to that land, and they start making their own settlements. So Zionism is the political ideology that believes in the settler colonization of Palestine by Israeli Jews. And it's really important that we know what this definition is, because a lot of times you're going to be called anti-Semitic if you say something against Israel. To be anti-Semitic means you hate on Jewish people, right? It means you're discriminated against or racist or prejudiced against Jewish people as an identity, as a religious identity. And we don't do that. We don't critique Israel because of their Jewish identity. We critique Israel because of their political belief of Zionism. So I very confidently am anti-Zionist. That doesn't make me anti-Semitic. I'm not talking about people of a Jewish religion by saying I don't support Zionism. When I say I don't support Zionism, we're saying I don't support the political ideology that Israel should exist as a settler colonial state over Palestine. I'm not saying Jewish people shouldn't exist. I'm not saying Jewish people shouldn't have a safe place to live. I'm saying Israel, the way it exists now, and the way it was intended to from the beginning, should not exist. And this is going to help you guys for when you're advocating for Palestine and someone says, you're anti-Semitic because you said you don't like Israel, you can say, actually, me critiquing Israel is critiquing Zionism, which is a political belief. I'm not critiquing Judaism. Right? Because again, there are a lot of Jewish organizations who truly understand their religion and support Palestine. So it's important to really know what Zionism is, because this is what we critique. This is what we're saying we're against. If it plays.
What is Zionism? Zionism is a political and national movement aimed at creating and sustaining a Jewish state in the Middle East. Now, according to many traditional and Orthodox Jewish teachings, Jews are forbidden by God to have their own state until their Messiah comes. But this hasn't stopped Zionism from pushing towards that very goal. So where did this all start? Let's go back to 1897. A man named Theodor Herzl formed the World Zionist Organization. He advocated for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, and is even mentioned in the Israeli Declaration of Independence. It was tough to be a Jew in Europe at that time. With anti-Semitic sentiments rising, Herzl felt the only way for his people to live in peace was for them to have their own country. Palestine was chosen, and a popular slogan started spreading around the world. A land without a people, for a people without a land. The only problem was, Palestine wasn't a land without a people. A large number of Muslims and Christians, along with a smaller number of Jews, had been living there together in peace for centuries. But for many Christian Zionists living in the West and Jewish Zionists living in Europe, that made little difference. Following the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, and along with British support, Jewish immigration to the newly British-occupied Palestine was steady in the early 20th century. Then there was a turning point, World War II. Following the Holocaust, the flow of Jews to occupied Palestine boomed, and many Western countries began backing the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. Although a UN resolution recommended both an independent Arab and Jewish state in the region, Israel went ahead and declared their independence in 1948, and was recognized by US President Harry Truman that very same day. The Zionist movement had achieved its main victory. In the period after its establishment, Israel carried out an invasion of neighboring countries, and at the end of 1967's Six-Day War, Israel extended its control in the region, displacing countless Christian and Muslim Palestinians. A year later, the 28th World Zionist Congress adopted the Jerusalem Program, a list of 5 goals, which are the current makeup of modern Zionism: the unity of the Jewish people and the centrality of Israel in Jewish life, the ingathering of the Jewish people in its historic homeland, the strengthening of the State of Israel, which is based on the prophetic vision of justice and peace, the preservation of the identity of the Jewish people through the fostering of Jewish and Hebrew education, and the protection of Jewish rights everywhere. In practice, their goals of justice and peace have been lost to many of the non-Jewish people living in the region. The Israeli military has been illegally controlling and occupying much of Palestine, and constant new illegal settlement building on Palestinian land by the Zionist state has been condemned by much of the international community. So what do you think about Zionism?
Okay. So what do you guys think about Zionism? It's not a good thing, right? It's and they those 5, I think it was 5, right? Like points that Zionism really focuses on. If you notice, it's all focused only for and on people who are Jewish, right? This is where the inequality comes in, right? And this is where we can critique Zionism very confidently. You're building a whole state and rules and laws for a whole country that you have come in and taken over, and you're giving rights to specific people based off their identity, and not giving the same rights to other people also because of their identity. And that's going to come in very importantly when we talk about apartheid, right? And why do we call it apartheid? Any questions about Zionism before we move on? We all get it's the political ideology, right, that was used to take over Palestine. I'm going to skip colonialism because I think we already kind of went over it and it is a longer video. Any questions though about the definition of colonialism and how Israel is a colonial state? Yeah. So colonialism is when one country, right, has power or can control and have power of a different country, but from farther away. So for example, the British and the French, and I think it might be on here, and we'll get to it after, had a lot of, they were the colonial powers of a lot of Arab countries. So the French had Lebanon and Syria, the British had Palestine and Jordan, and I think another country, and Egypt. Right? So what that means is they were able to control that country and take away its resources from far away. What makes something settler colonialism, which is what Israel did or is doing now, is when you do that, but you physically go in and settle in that country. So the French did that to Algeria, right? The French, when they were colonizing the world, went into Algeria and started putting in French settlements in place of Algerian homes. Algerians fought back and they had a very successful revolution and they were able to kick the French out. Right? In Palestine, that hasn't happened yet. But that's the main goal, that's the main definition of colonialism, is a different country, and historically in the past, it was a lot of European countries can have power over and take away the resources of another country. But we're just gonna, okay. So this is the map that I was talking about, to talk about colonialism. So look at the date here, right? This is the 1800s to 1916. And it's important to know that it ends at 1916, 1917. Everything in orange was under French control. So again, Lebanon, Syria, right? Everything in green is British control. And actually, these borders of the Arab world did not exist until the French and the British came in. Right, so there were Lebanese people, there were Palestinian people, there were Syrian people, but these borders that divided their countries so intensely were actually written up and like literally drawn, like they literally drew it by the French and the British based off which countries they wanted and which resources from each country they wanted. Right, so the French was like, I want this area, and this is where Lebanese people are because they have these resources, so we're gonna create this border, call it Lebanon, it's mine. The British wanted under it, so they created the border. There's Palestinians there, we're calling it Palestine, that one's for the British. So it's also important to understand that these borders are all colonial constructs. That's what we call them. So a lot of times when we hear Arabs say, I don't care, Lebanese people treat Palestinians very badly. There's a lot, and I say that because I know it, right? There's a lot of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon because it's one of the closest countries to go to when they had to leave. There's a lot of refugee camps in southern Lebanon. There's a lot of Lebanese people who don't care, who think it's a different country, so it's not my problem. But if we learn the history, right, and we see that we were all one unified Arab world in the first place, then maybe that would help people to care. But this is important because we have to know that the French had Palestine when the French and British colonized a lot of the Arab world. Because what they did was, as they left, right, so for all these other Arab countries, eventually the colonial powers left, right? They all had their own revolutions, or they stood up, they fought back, they got their land back, they left. What happened uniquely to Palestine, and only to Palestine, is that after the British left, the British government signed this, or as they were leaving, they signed what's called the Balfour Declaration in 1917. And basically what it says, and what they do, is that it says, we favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. A national home for the Jewish people is Zionism. Right? So by signing this, the British government promised that after they leave Palestine, Israeli Zionists are allowed to go in and create Israel as a homeland for Jewish people. So this is also important when people say things like, well, Israel is just better, they're stronger. Clearly, they're meant to be there if they're the ones who won. But from the very beginning, right, they're being aided and given things just like that. And this is also important to know the date because it's 1917. Right, so a lot of times the excuse that was used for 1948 was, well, look at the Holocaust, right? The Holocaust happened, we have no safe place, we need it. The Holocaust in World War II wasn't until 1939 to 1940s. This was already written in 1917. Right, so as much as this religious excuse for a homeland is used, there's a lot of, if we really look at dates in history, we see that that was just something that was added on as an excuse to do it. The plans for a Zionist mission was way before this. Right, the plans for control and domination was way before the Holocaust happened. Yes? No, I think they did. Just like all the other Arab countries, they did want it. They did try to fight for it. Palestinians have been fighting since day one. The problem is, and what makes it different, is that the British gave a lot of the control to Israelis in the first place. So imagine you've already been fighting another colonial power, and you finally get out of it, and all the other Arab countries are rebuilding and regrowing and making their governments, and the moment you're trying to do that, someone else comes in. Right? And so you're fighting constantly after another person, but they definitely did want it, yes. Why did Jewish people leave? So because of what happened at the Holocaust, right? And they felt they've been planning a Jewish homeland, right? They want a state that's theirs. They've just been wanting a state that's theirs. That's a question I actually don't know if I can answer, anyone can answer. And what my guess is power and control. People get greedy and want power and control. Or they see other countries with like, why do they get to have a country where it's all the same? We want a country that's all the same, right? But these countries, most countries aren't founded on religion. They're founded on like race or ethnicity, right? Like you can be Lebanese but be of any religion. There's like 15 religions in Lebanon, right? So that's what makes them unique too, is that their whole state is just founded on what religion you are, right? You are Israeli if you are Jewish. Whereas in Palestine, all religions are welcome, right? You could be Palestinian and Muslim, you could be Palestinian Christian, you could be Palestinian Jewish. So for me, I think it just comes down to greed and power and control is what they wanted. So this is important because, okay, so 1917, this gets signed. 30-ish years later, right, and the British leave on May 14th, 1948. May 15th, 1948 is the Nakba. This was the word that I was trying to ask when I said what happened in 1948. what happened in 1948 is called the Nakba. The Nakba in Arabic means catastrophe. So its literal translation is catastrophe. Why is it called a catastrophe? What happened? Yes. They started moving in, right? And for Israelis to move in, who had to be kicked out? Palestinians, right, exactly. So it's actually a good video shows pictures of it too.
70 years have passed since the Nakba, the catastrophe in Arabic, took place in Palestine in 1948, in which more than 750,000 Palestinians were forcefully displaced from their homes and pushed into refugee camps in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and neighboring countries. But the Nakba didn't end in 1948. The catastrophe continues to affect more than 12 million Palestinians, who remain stateless today. Historical Palestine was mostly made up of Palestinian Muslims, Christians, and a small number of Jews, who generally lived together peacefully. The persecution of Jews across Europe led them to believe that they were not safe there, and Zionists saw Palestine as a prime location for a Jewish homeland.
And it was clear that there were Palestinians on the land. Zionist leaders and common people alike were got used to the idea that the only way of making Palestine a Jewish state is by causing the Palestinians to leave.
The Jewish Zionist movement began organizing immigration and buying land in Palestine. This was the first step in turning Palestine into a Jewish homeland. Then World War I began. Britain promised Zionist support for a Jewish national home in Palestine. This came as a formal political letter, known today as the Balfour Declaration. It also included that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. When World War I ended and the Ottoman Empire was defeated, Britain occupied Palestine.
Britain provided the muscle under which they could simply emigrate. I mean, they couldn't have immigrated were it not for the British presence. Because the crucial battle in the early stages was simply getting Jews into Palestine and acquiring land. They couldn't have done that without British government's sponsorship.
Jewish migration into Palestine continued for decades, and the Palestinian people organized large demonstrations against this influx. Palestinians saw British support of Zionism as biased and unfair. So the people of Palestine revolted in 1936 to fight against British and Zionist occupation. During the 3-year uprising, thousands of Palestinians were killed, and hundreds of British citizens and Jewish Zionists died as well. Britain dismantled the Palestinian Revolution, leaving them with no political or military leadership. However, the British also began limiting Jewish migration. This upset the Jews who had fought with the British during the uprising and led them to create their own forces. Zionist militias carried out bombing attacks against both the British and the Palestinians. As things got out of hand, the British announced in 1947 that they'd be ending their mandate on Palestine. The file on Palestine was then transferred to the UN, which suggested dividing Palestine into an Arab and Jewish state. As the British were preparing to leave, the new Jewish population began taking over, and it helped that they were heavily armed. The ethnic cleansing of Palestinians began months before the British officially left Palestine. Zionists were taking over major cities and hundreds of villages, forcing thousands of Palestinians into neighboring countries.
It happened many times that the Israeli, very holy soldiers took 10 of the youngsters in the middle of the village, shot them just in order to kill them, in order that all the others will see it and run away. And if it's not enough, they took others also.
The British ended their mandate on May 14, 1948, leaving their tanks and armored weapons to the newly created State of Israel. From the time the British occupied Palestine in 1917 to when they left in 1948, the number of Jews is estimated to have multiplied 10 times to 500,000. As Zionist Jews declared the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, the surrounding Arab nations declared war with the objective of liberating Palestine. Although Palestine had the support of other Arab nations and they outnumbered the Jewish population, the Israelis also had foreign military, political, and financial support.
They were highly prepared, highly dedicated, well-armed, fighting force, which was superior to all the Arab armies combined.
Israel grew beyond the UN partition lines during the Arab-Israeli War by destroying Arab villages and further reducing the Palestinian population. By April 1949, more than 500 villages and 10 cities were captured by the Israelis. Over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes, and over 13,000 Palestinians had been killed. Even then, the Nakba did not end. Today, Israel occupies the whole of historical Palestine. Israelis continue to build illegal settlements on occupied Palestinian territory. Palestinians in the West Bank live under military law, which subjects them to checkpoints, curfews, and arbitrary arrests. Palestinians in Gaza live under a blockade imposed by Israel. Gaza is set to become unlivable by 2020. Palestinians today continue to demand their right to return to their homes. For them, the Nakba will not end until this right is granted.
Okay, so we're gonna take a break in like a minute, but real quick to show us the actual map. Also, did anyone, this video is clearly a couple of years old because it said Gaza was said to be unlivable by 2020 to 2021, and it's definitely unlivable, right? So that's really important. So let's look at what actually happened. Right, so, and what's important in that video to know about the Nakba and what he said was the British left a lot of their tanks, their missiles, their military weapons for the Zionists when they left, right? They saw that it was getting out of hand, and it was said it was getting out of hand, but at that point, Zionists had so much power, right? The greed, I guess, kicked in, right? And they saw the control that they could take, and they started going against the British too, and instead of really doing anything, the British was like, you know what, we're out. It's yours now, right? And so the British and UN and European countries are very complicit in the beginning. America, United States comes in the 60s, and we'll get to that. But so very quickly, right? So 1945, Palestine. May 14, 1948, we start seeing the 220 plus Palestinian towns and villages being depopulated. So the red dots are the Palestinian villages that are supposed to leave because that's supposed to make way for Israel or Jewish Zionists to settle in. And the dotted lines is what was supposed to become Palestine versus Israel. What actually happens is what we see in 1949, where more of the red dots show up. All of those Palestinians are now going to be displaced because all of that land is now going to Jewish Israeli settlers. Do we know what the dotted lines are? So this is kind of similar, right? But this map is really important. And we're going to stop where we're at right now is the second one, 1948 to 67. That's what it becomes. The blue is Israel, is Jewish Israeli settlers. This is all within that time period. And then the yellow is what's Palestine. The small one on the left, your left, is which one? Is that Gaza or the West Bank? The small one on this side, on the left. That's Gaza. So in case you don't, that's where Gaza is, right? The bigger one is the West Bank. There's something different between 2 and 3. What's different in the orange part? Yes, I see your hand up. There's stripes. So something happens between 67 that I keep mentioning that allows that. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and when we come back, we'll get into that. Sounds good? Okay, so you guys can take a break, stretch, water, move around, whatever you need to do. We'll start again in 5 minutes.